Okay, guys, and with that air of informality, I want to welcome everybody. My name is Nirit Harel. I'm very privileged to be here at first time speaking at Global Entrepreneurship Week, which I have so much respect for, and certainly my first time doing that here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, my new home. I'm really privileged to be here to tell you a story. It's my story. It's the story of a nation. It's a land that's the embodiment of innovation. Along with my George C., who's will speak thoughts about what we might do to leverage some of these ideas here in my new home, strengthen another to make one another better. This is pre-state Israel. This is the Israel that my grandparents, and my great-grandparents came to. They encountered barren, dry, they were outnumbered by hostile neighbors. In 1930, when my grandfather was 10 years old, his parents packed him up from a comfortable life, home and business in Białystok, Poland. They sensed that something terrible was about to happen in Europe, and their friends and families ridiculed them, and they told them, "You're crazy. You're going to drink oil and you're going to eat sand. Why are you leaving everything to go to a place like that?" And of course, they were almost right, because Israel has little to no natural resources. It's a tiny plot of land in the Middle East and have oil. Moses found the one spot in the area that had no oil. Still, it's an innovation center of all times. Its strength is an innovative thought. The resources are human. What do you do when you don't have resources? You trust in your... Having said that, this is the birthplace of the world and of monotheism. It's an immigration melting pot in many ways like the US that recognizes the talents and uniqueness of each individual. We maximize these contributions, and people have people there from 70 countries, each of them bringing a different perspective and experience. Let me show you Israel today, and you can see some good statistics there about the founding of the country 72 years ago, our size. We are just about the size of New Jersey. You can split us right now by 5 hours in the center of the country. And we only have 20% arable land. So if you really look at all of this, we're talking about a miracle. There was a CBS interview, famous in 1956, with David Ben-Gurion, who was Israel's first prime minister, saying that in Israel, in order to be a realist, you have to believe in miracles. It's one of my favorites, and you'll see that at the bottom of the screen. It's a great, miraculous example of innovation. With no natural resources and naturally water poor, we've made the desert blue. 85 water. We've become a leader in water tech, and it's the only country, incidentally, that finished the last century with more trees than the one before. Or entered the new century with more trees than the one before. We're the #1 quality of tech institutes outside of the US, 7 research institutions, laureates in the decade. Investment Institute, which I alluded to before, is the only institute in the top 15 that's outside of the US. Ranks #6 ahead of Stanford and Caltech. We have the highest percentage in the world of home computers per capita, and we also lead the world in the number of scientists and technicians in the workforce. We've got about 145 per 10,000 as opposed to 85 in the US, 70 in Japan, 60 in Germany. 25% of our workforce is employed in technical professions. So let's move on to really the main subject, which is what makes this an innovative system, and what's the tech and all of this behind it that may be able to be leveraged for us here. Some stats by the Economic Forum, the World Economic Forum, which you may be familiar with. First in the world for flexibility and adaptability. First in the scientific research. For entrepreneurship. First for information technology. For expenditure as a percentage of GDP. We produce more scientific papers per capita than any nation by a huge margin, 109 for every 10,000 people. Second in the world for innovative capacity. Second in the world for venture capital. Venture capital is extremely strong in Israel. And 30% of R&D invested is coming through, which is a very... have yet much to learn about the ecosystem here in Texas. But the academic and industrial, the partnerships between industry and academia are incredibly important in Israel, because we start with patents and then do the technology transfers. Highest per capita density of startups. We have 6,000 startups. You can see some of the buzzwords in the center of your screen to help you remind, help you. 1,000 new firms are launched every year. One startup per every 1,400 people or so. That's the highest in density, but second in absolute numbers to the US, of course, which is so much larger than us. 1/5 of investment in cyber security, and 10% of global spending on cyber. We're a leader in smart mobility. You'll see a little bit more about that later. And you literally can't touch your phone without encountering Israeli technology. So probably during the course of a normal day, people are touching between 15 and 100 Israeli innovations on any given day. We have more than anywhere, as I said. Why is that so? If you look at the screen on the right, I've given you a few things to remember and take home with you. Necessity drives invention. There's a self-reliance that makes us independent. Our geographic isolation, small size, surrounded by enemies, that means we're focused on exports, mainly in non-manufacturing heavy solutions because of scalability. That way is not restricted by borders of transportation. Solving mentality. If you've ever encountered an Israeli, the best thing to do with them is to challenge them that something can't be done. You'll know that they will be the first ones to make sure that there's a solution. We're very big on pushing the status quo and pushing boundaries and taking the necessary risks. Very high risk takers is the VC investment. For those of you who don't know, we're a military culture. Everyone is it means at the end of the day that we have a field mentality where just because something isn't your responsibility, it doesn't mean that it's not your problem. This mandatory draft means that we have high pressure decision making to do, and it encourages leadership and an entrepreneurialism. We need to improvise to solve problems in real time field conditions. The famous 8200 unit, which is an intelligence unit in Israel, is really turned into the most influential incubator in Israel. It rolls out founders and new technologies into civilian applications, which are quite extraordinary. The public-private partnership piece here is super important. We're very much dependent on our relationship with the government. The government puts huge investment into Israeli technology. 30 programs that support startups, and the government is heavily invested in pushing people into industry and bringing investment. In fact, we have an entire office that's dedicated to this. The final piece that I'd like to, melting pot piece, we are a nation of immigrants. When you've got 70 countries represented and also contributing in various levels of technology, they're all very, very technically oriented people. We've really benefited from diversity and learned how important and how good diversity can be to a society and to a work environment. Some of you will remember that when the Iron Curtain fell in the Soviet Union, the Jewish community that had been persecuted under that regime, a vast number of those people, over 1 million people, Israel, and have brought incredible technical skills. But we have many examples of that. It's the gathering of the exiles, for those of you who are familiar with the Bible. After 2,000 exile, the Jewish people have been coming back, and we really have learned what an amazing piece, what a contribution it can make to our. It's a very flat structure also, because we're so focused on problem solving. We don't have a lot of the pyramid schemes that you see in other places in management. Finally, I want to point out this idea that everything will be okay. In Israel we say "Yeh beseder," it'll all be fine, just keep moving. And I think that that faith is a driving force that really helps us to take huge risks, but also to get the rewards. The ethos of the startup in Israel is get it done and ship it. And so there really is an understanding that perfect is the enemy of good, which is something that Voltaire says and we often hear. Although if you ask the godfather of Israeli high-tech, Yossi Vardi, who I know quite well, he'll tell you that the driver of success in Israel is the Jewish mother who likes to tell her children, I've done so much for you, the least you can do is bring me a Nobel Prize. So you'll incidentally find that in other nations, those immigrants that are most likely to start billion-dollar ventures are Israeli. R&D. Hopefully you'll recognize a few names that you know here and are familiar with. I'd like to just point out a few of them. It's by now that a lot of the R&D centers are functional. Warren Buffett has a lot to say about it. Warren, Israel is the best place to invest because of its people. There's no other place with such high quality people with motivation and abilities that Israel, and that we should continue to do what we're doing. We need to most comfortable conditions for investors. But he says it also reminds him of the United States after its birth. A nation and motivation and intelligence and initiative of people, it's extraordinary. And technology, quite familiar with the company that he bought in the north of Israel, Iskar, developed by friends of our family. He's a huge share of all that goes on. Bill Gates also, he actually says Israel, by many measures, to its population, has contributed to the technology revolution. So a few examples from what you have in front of you. Intel was the first multinational to come to Israel to set up their R&D center. They have a chip design center that in 1974 was quite early to come to the Israeli market. They developed the Centrino bridge in Israel. Oracle, I think also here also appears, which designed the Amazon Kindle, or rather one of the startups that it acquired designed the Kindle. Today we know that it's the undisputed leader in that e-reader category. The printing press, developed by Indigo in Israel, which was acquired by HP. HP it's become the world leader in digital commercial presses. So this whole idea of enabling print directly from computers all happened in Israel. Making it count. So I think one of the things that makes our industry unique is this sense of responsibility for making the world better, which is a Jewish value that's really seeped into how we do our work. This concept of tikkun olam, repairing the world, is something that really drives Israeli innovation. And there is a sense of responsibility that when we've come up with something great, we shared with the world to make people's lives better. You may have seen in a previous slide a quote by Shimon Peres, which was Prime Minister of Israel, and then President, most famous for President. That what really drives us is a sense of dissatisfaction, that we always feel that we can make things better. Make life better. So with your permission, I'm going to give you a few examples of specific ways and specific technologies, hopefully ones that are also relevant to Texas. So the environment, we're all very interested in the environment and in sustainability over time. I think we have to be. Are we water rich or water poor? Israel by nature is, of course, water, but I've told you before that we become world leaders. What are some of the things that actually contribute to this? Water from the air. This is a very good example. There's a company called WaterGen, which necessity is the mother of invention, as we say, was trying to figure out how to bring water to soldiers in the south of Israel in the desert. So WaterGen figured out that if we could take the condensation from the air, we actually could produce filtered running water to help the soldiers in the south of Israel. And this is now a technology that's become commercial and can be used in high volume. The humidity comes from the air, it's vaporized into water. That's already in the atmosphere and is perfect for desert climates. So it also accounts for air pollution and makes this a lot safer to drink. It's already, in fact, you'll be interested to know that in the earthquake in 2017, many natural disasters around the globe, but certainly in Puerto Rico, this was very prevalent in the field. Agriculture. So those of you who are familiar with drip irrigation, this is a technology that came out of Israel in 1965, I think. In the mid-60s, there was an on the land, and that there were two trees next to one another, one growing very large, one of them kind of small and shrunken. And he wondered why that might happen. And as he got closer, he realized that the water pipe that was feeding the tree that was bigger had been leaking. What that meant is that that tree was getting exposed to water, specifically water that's being dripped into its roots in a specific area in the specific amounts that it needed to grow, while conserving water for the rest of the crops. So this particular technology, Natafim, is a technology that's been picked over the world, really changing people's lives. It's not uncommon for me to speak at conferences where people from India and Africa approach me and thank me for changing their lives for. It's an embarrassing moment for me because, of course, it's not me who did it, but they have such a great appreciation for being able to stop. Israel, certainly the yields went up by 5%, but there are even more arid climates that are using this technology and really making a huge difference. This is being used in about 100 countries now, and people being or hectares of land being exposed. Another example that you don't have here is BioBee, which is a harmless pest control solution. The idea of that solution is to use the natural environment, insects, as deterrents. So it's a fascinating thing because the greenhouse, the harmless insects, bees pollinating and beetles and so on, that would otherwise need pests to control the quality of the product and to make it safer. The modern technology, cherry tomato, is also something that came out of Israel. Long shelf life, abundant growth. They took the best of all the various tomatoes and it became a breakthrough in the 70s. So that's something that most of us are familiar with. That came out of the agriculture school of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So a lot of hybrid work is done with food. Lots of crossing of vegetables and fruits that didn't exist before. It's been quite an exciting time, and it's helped us to feed the world. Another development in food, which doesn't appear here, I'm trying to give you bits and pieces familiar as well as new things that have just come out. I've been exposed recently to 3D printing of food. Sustainable meat also is coming out. So quite familiar with super meat. In addition to plant food alternatives or plant-based meat alternatives, clean meats are coming out. So between the two, we're looking at a $14.2 billion market by 2022. So we're looking at a market share of 33% by 2050. Clean meat is really not a meat substitute. They're actually taking cells from living animals or from animals in order to produce an actual meat, which is an incredible thing to see, because if you look at the way that that's going to affect the environment overall, livestock systems are occupying 45% of the Earth's surface and are responsible for greenhouse emissions, 4,000 liters of water that are needed to produce 1 kilogram of meat. The total water footprint of animal production constitutes about 29%. So there are startups like Supermeat and also foundations that are working in this direction. Medical. Some of these you may recognize. The emergency bandage on the left was created by a military medic, of course, because they were having trouble stopping bleeding in the field. This particular bandage can be wrapped with one hand and used in the field. It was used for NATO peacekeeping mission in Bosnia. It's now being used in militaries and special forces of the US, Australia, New Zealand, and many other countries. If you remember the shooting of U.S. Representative Gabrielle Giffords in 2011 in Tucson, this is actually the instrument that was Teva, which you see in the middle, Copaxone, was developed in, this drug was developed in the Weizmann Institute. I mentioned before that there's a huge emphasis on the life cycle of the product, which begins in the research, but then goes to technology transfer, which happens quite extensively at Weizmann. They're one of the world leaders. We're actually looking in one of my businesses to bring that technology transfer into Portugal. It's an interesting thing to explore here as well. But Copaxone it received FDA approval in 1996. Teva has 46,000 employees. It's a very, very large company which is credited with this drug, which is now being used to treat MS. But they also are the largest producer of generic pharmaceuticals. So quite a familiar name in most places. ReWalk, that you see on the left bottom corner, is an exoskeleton that was developed by a man who was in an accident, a professor who had become a paraplegic and wanted to have some solution to walk again. So if you look closely, you'll see the man is standing. This is done quite well and shown up in marathons and Paralympics. This attaches to the body and allows people the flexibility and independence to stand and walk, to go watch, and gives people a little more of their dignity back. It's quite an amazing thing that we've used with a lot of our soldiers also. The pill cam that you see in the middle was developed for gastro problems. It can be swallowed. That will follow in order to root out digestive issues. It's been used since 2011, I think, when it won the award in Europe for the best new invention. It's FDA approved and can also be used outside the hospital for patients that need to be followed but can't come in, and has diagnosed intestinal disorders, cancer in the digestive system, and others. So it's a real revolution. The first prototype actually, I think, came out in the late 90s even, and took some time to be approved. It's a wonderful product. The last product that you see on the screen is one that I'm personally involved with. It's the Bishu. Bishu was designed in order to help the elderly to increase their stability, because we found that cause of death very often was falls that people. The Bishu is quite unique because it's built with a heel that can sense if someone is losing their stability, and it inflates and deflates the heel just at the right angle in order to prevent a fall. I learned a lot about the subject that I didn't know before. I hadn't realized that most people fall backwards. And so the heel was a very important piece of this in the various clinical trials, and it's early in its development, but it's had over a 95% success rate. So we have really high hopes for this product. Other potential things you might encounter in the market that are Israeli. Very recently, there's been a non-invasive device to measure blood sugar and insulin for diabetics that doesn't require puncturing the skin. The sniff phone is in development. It should be out soon, based on this whole idea of the bionic that replicates the ability of dogs to sense and sniff out various diseases. There is a nose that can do that, or a breathalyzer that can do it, but the idea is to be able to bring this to your smartphone in order to be able to detect things very easily with somewhere between 86 and 93% degree of accuracy. It'll be a plug-in for a smartphone. In which there could be interesting collaboration with Texas, is this area of security. I know that there's quite a lot of defense and security that goes on. We're very focused in Israel on the software side, data and security. So you can see a few good examples here of inventions that you probably already know. The flash drive was devised by one of my former clients, M Systems in Israel, which came up with this called a disk on key, smaller, but that was acquired by SanDisk in 2006, I believe, and now has become a very big and commonplace thing that people use all the time. Checkpoint is the company that came up with Firewall. That's the software that protects our data from cyber attacks. So these patents were done in Israel. It became commercial in 1993, and they're working with major companies like Nokia, of course, in order to make sure that we're safer. Iron Dome you may not be as familiar with, or maybe you are from the news. Iron Dome is the solution, the military solution that protects Israel in time. Clearly, it's not a real dome, but it forms a dome in the air. I love this depiction because it shows sort of the radius. I believe that this can actually detect within 43 miles whether we're having some artillery fired, mortars, helicopters, aircrafts. That's the range. And what the solution does is it fires missiles in order to take those out before they land. So it's got been quite successful, very high success rate. And it's something that was developed in Israel, but funded together with the US. So we're grateful for that support. It's been a game changer for Israeli security. Another technology that you may not know quite as well is the brief cam that appears on the right. The brief cam is a surveillance software. It's a platform that makes video searchable and actionable and quantifiable. It allows rapid video review and search. This was actually funded by a friend of mine in YPO Israel, who's an angel investor, who's very involved with this in Mobileye. But you may be interested to know, and I'm quite proud to learn, that BriefCam was the solution that actually enabled law enforcement to identify the marathon Boston bombers. I'm going to speed through the next one so that we have enough time to get to some questions. I'll give you a couple of quick points on this one because I think this one is going to be familiar to everybody. But those of you who are using Waze to navigate around your city may not know that Waze was developed in Israel. This was a game changer because it's the first time that they were using outsourcing, crowdsourcing rather, to develop or sort of get a sense of where we are on the map and in terms of where we're going and where there may be accidents. This was sold to Google for $1.1 billion. At the time, it was a very big exit in 2013. It's now got 50 million users. Mobileye, which many of us may be familiar with from the press and less so in our cars, although that's changing, is a wonderful car technology that was developed in '99. The algorithms, they're the algorithms for a tiny camera. The camera is hiding in the car, basically tells you if there's someone about to hit you, and actually has at the end of the day dropped accidents by 40 to 50% and saved a ton of lives. It actually can swerve and can control the car if the driver loses control. You can imagine how this changes the ecosystem for truck drivers driving long distances and can be in quite severe accidents. So countless lives have been saved. Communications. I've chosen 3. Israel. I've chosen 3 to share with you in particular. Voice over IP, which I guess everyone knows about, was developed in Israel. The wireless technology that we use in our mobile phones actually came from the Motorola in Israel. You see it in a flip phone here, but of course all of us are touching it daily in whatever format we're using it in our daily lives. Most of the technology that you find within the mobile phone can be traced back to Israeli engineering. So it's quite amazing in keyboards and others. ICQ, which I'm less familiar with in name, was actually the predecessor to messaging, to instant messaging. ICQ comes from the name IC. It was acquired by AOL for $407 million in 1998, which was a lot of money at the time. But it's the first time that we had this universal instant messenger platform in real time. So briefly, what can we learn from the field that hopefully we can apply also to our businesses? And I hope that my friend George will be able to talk a little bit more to those synergies. I'm going to let him do that in a moment. But lemons can always be turned into lemonade. Israelis believe that there is nothing that can't be done. And there is no situation that we can't find the best in. So if you look at Israel's existence and Israel's history to begin with, we are a lemonade stand. We are the lemons to lemonade story after being exiled for 2,000 years. A rebirth in 1948, just 72 years ago, in a very harsh land with difficult conditions, with malaria. We've been able to innovate and think outside the box, and that's much part of the Israeli mentality. I lead a trip for YPO to Israel every year on the innovative mindset of Israel. And I think that one of the big takeaways that people have when they leave is that they've really changed the way that they think, regardless of what they're doing and where they are, that there's a real innovative problem-solving part of the culture that people like to take home with them. Directness and transparency, this works both ways. You might know that the national fruit of Israel is the cactus fruit. We're known for being prickly on the outside and sweet on the inside. The Israeli mentality is very direct and very blunt. If we're not careful, we can go to the extreme. But the upside is that people are transparent in their business dealings and in their personal lives. So that builds enormous trust. What you see is what you get. And I think that's, as long as it's not becoming rude or aggressive, we're okay. So we have to find the balance. But when people know you're being upfront, they trust you and they feel more secure doing business. Number 3, community is everything. So I can't stress this enough. The entire Israeli ecosystem is built upon relationships and people doing and supporting one another in the best way that they can, whether it's people that went to school together, went to the army together. In the US and in other places, the focus tends to be on the individual. I think Israel is very successful because of the networking mentality there. Entrepreneurs do it more aggressively everywhere, I would imagine, but this is a tremendous advantage. We're small, we're interconnected, and the ability to get to the right people at the right time is very important. Very willing to help each other, and it's a huge assistance to entrepreneurs at various stages of development. So what I can do at this stage is to really recommend that you pay it forward, because when you help people, they remember and they help you. The focus on and government and industry relationships is super important in Israel. I've mentioned it once before, but because the life cycle begins in science and outward, it's government that's really important in planting some of that money. We have quite a lot of public-private partnerships, and we're really dependent on that funding in order to, and that support in order to grow. Number 5, encouraging self-starting graduates to start companies. I mean, this is something that American mentality. I went to UCLA, and I remember in those days that our main focus was to find a good job and build our resume. I think we are having more and more of a focus these days on getting strong graduates to start their own businesses and go right to making the world better if we can. If they've got these amazing ideas that can make things better and they've got the right personality, then we are encouraging people to go and build businesses, rather than getting what we used to call real jobs. Number 6, nothing's too daring. So we said before, yeah, it'll all be okay. You know, where there's a will, there's a way. The founder of Israel used to say it. If you want it, it will be. So that's the way we make things happen. You take on the big challenges, and especially the ones that people say that can't be done. Mobilize is a very good example. My friend Aviram from YPO Israel said that this company's engineers were always motivated by solving problems that nobody could solve. So it's a very exciting thing to be able to do that, and they've done it very successfully at the tune of $15.3 billion exit to Intel. Number 7, fall in love with the problem, not the solution. I think that many of the things that we see, or many of the problems that we encounter with entrepreneurs is founder syndrome and this love of their solution and getting it out to market, regardless of whether it's the right solution or the wrong solution, or if anyone wants to buy it. Sometimes we need to pivot. So most people who are doing this right have found a problem and a gap in the industry that needs to be filmed and are solved and needs to be tackled with the right solution. And the final piece, and perhaps the most important piece, is to get the right people on the bus. What we learned from field and military service is that sometimes the small elite team is more valuable than a large platoon, and that we need to make sure that the people that are immediately around us are the right people and are moving in the right direction, are complimenting one another of their skills, and are really fully dedicated to making this happen. So maybe I'll close with one small story before I, let's see if I can figure out how to do this, before I hand off to George, which I'm excited to do. I'll share one small story that really shows a little bit of the Israeli mentality and how this all came. And it's a story about the banana machine. This: an American home appliance executive wakes up, decides to create a machine to straighten bananas so they can be sliced better. He calls up his American and Israeli R&D teams. He wants to solve the problem. The American team leader comes up with great detailed work, hires 15 people, produces a $2,000 machine after 2 or 3 years of hard work. The Israeli, on the other hand, interrupts the executive after 3 minutes because he's got chutzpah. He's jumps right in. And he says, this idea is stupid, but okay, if you think it can't be done, let me show you how it's done. 11 days, he comes back with a $13 machine, which makes perfectly straight bananas. It works 60% of the time, and is ready to go to market within the next 3 months. So what we've really learned from this example, and it's not all good, we all have our good and our bad, but the essence of the Israeli innovator is to find a smarter solution by spending as little time and money as possible and going straight to market. So if any of you are interested in building a banana machine, I'm your girl. I think the next thing that we're looking at now in my business is how we strengthen the relationship with Texas. And I'm looking now at potentially building a venture capital fund that will fund those Israeli businesses and make it possible for them to come and build their businesses here in Texas, in this amazing state with the amazing possibilities and positive work culture. No image of the banana machine. No, I have not got an image of the banana machine. I would like with no further ado, to my colleague and friend George, who's a fellow YPOer, so almost family. He's a local prominent businessman, and I think is just in the best position to share what the benefits of this unique and incredible relationship between Texas and Israel is and can be, and how we can strengthen one another. He's a licensed with tremendous experience, chair of Annandale Capital. He's done some work with the Secretary of State and the Governor of Texas, the U.S. State Department in Washington, but most importantly for us today, he is the chairman of the Texas-Israel Alliance. And I want to encourage all of you, if you have interest in doing business with Israel, of course, please reach out to me, but please also reach out to the Alliance, which is doing amazing things to make sure that this relationship continues and grows and strengthens for the benefit of both. And I think there are many. So let me see if I can. George, I'm leaving this to you. And I'm going to be sharing the screen so that you can see your slide.
Oh, perfect. I got let in. I was starting to worry that I was being sent a passive aggressive message not being let in. Nirit, thank you so much for letting me be on today. It's a real privilege, and great presentation, great summation of all the wonderful things going on in Israel. And I really am glad that you identified Shimon Peres on several occasions. my grandfather and Shimon Peres were dear friends. They were both secretaries of defense or defense ministers
Oh,
during
here
the
you are.
Civil War.
Okay. I couldn't hear you before. Can everyone hear George?
My microphone is on.
Okay. I couldn't hear you before.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great.
Thank
I think I was a bit at the mercy of someone turning on my microphone and my visual. So I'm glad somebody did. I appreciate that. So Nirit, thank you so much for having me on today. It's a real pleasure and privilege, and your presentation was just outstanding and showed all the advances that Israel has put forth over such an amazingly short period of time. And I was saying before that I'm so grateful that you mentioned Shimon Peres, because he and my grandfather were very dear friends. They both were either defense minister or secretary of defense at the same time during the Yom Kippur War, and worked together extensively on the logistics necessary to offset that sneak attack in record fashion and preserve the Israeli state. And it's appropriate for this conversation because my grandfather was a Texan and had done business all over the Middle East and was very familiar with the Middle East. So that's a good transition into this slide. And if you do me a big favor, once I stop talking about the statistics, take down the slide and put me back up, because I'd rather talk directly to the viewers after I get done with it. It'll probably take about 2 minutes.
That sounds like a great idea.
You see on the slide that Israel's per capita GDP, this slide says 43, 45. It's really more like 43,000 now. And Texas is now over 60,000 per capita GDP. When I went to Israel for the first time in 1985, the per capita GDP was 7,000. Israel was a third world country, and it had a lot of poverty and a lot of begging and a lot of heavily armed 19-year-olds in the IDF. So it's a real different place right now. And if someone hasn't been in a long time, I highly encourage them to see the country, because it's transformed forever. And the Texas-Israel alliance, to shift to what we're here to talk about on the back end of Nirit's outstanding presentation, is basically a nonprofit organization with a sole purpose. And it's nice to be in an organization that has a sole purpose, because it's pretty simple and straightforward. All we're designed to do is dramatically increase the commerce between the nation of Israel and the state of Texas. That's all we do. And it's a two-way street. I think that's one thing that's super important to pass along, is that Israel is such a compelling place and people should want to do business there and interact with their companies there. But we also want to pull Israelis out of a, not to be crude or critical, because this is not critical, but out of a navel gazing posture and actually look around the world a little bit too. And when you cast your gaze upon Texas, you're looking at the state in the United States that is the most dynamic and the most powerful dynamic economy and country in the world. And anyone who doesn't want to be doing business in Texas is not thinking very clearly. So we are all about two-way streets. Texas companies doing significant business in Israel, and Israeli companies doing significant business in Texas, both with Texas companies and other multinational corporations that do business in Texas. And I saw several people on our call are from all over the world. And one thing most people may not be aware of is that Israel and Texas are almost at identical latitudes. So some of our topography, geography, landscapes look very, very similar. There are parts of Texas that are very green and lush and full of water, but there's quite a bit that are extremely arid and dry and semi-arid deserts. So there's quite a bit of commonality in the way the countries look. The business climates, after Israel has moved from kibbutzim and socialism into more of a pure capitalism under Bibi and other leaders, is very similar in that outlook. And the governments, for better or for worse, and I'm not saying anything political, are both pretty conservative. They want to get out of the way of commerce and business and industry and let the magic of the free market work. And one thing I want to emphasize too, before I pass it back to Nirit for questions and comments, because there's a lot to discuss with the audience if they'd like to, is the number of industries in commonality between Texas and Israel. Texas has a very, very vibrant healthcare industry, technology industry, healthcare technology industry. Our agricultural industry is significant. Our oil and gas industry is significant. And who would have thought of oil and gas in Israel? For years, the big joke is that God knew that to give the Jews, the Hebrews, something to overcome. So he left them as the only country in the Middle East that did not have fossil fuels or petroleum. Well, here we have the Leviathan gas field offshore in Israel. So now that's a joke you can't use anymore. But Texas know-how in oil and gas technology is unparalleled and should be utilized much more extensively in Israel. And then you go further on with that in defense. And obviously, Israel has got one of the most vibrant, impressive militaries in the world. And the defense industry is most vibrant in the United States and Texas. So there's a lot to go from there too, as well as cybersecurity, as well as finance and banking and investment. There's just so many cross grounds to go. And I'll close with this. Israel's bilateral trade and economic activity between it and New York State is about $6 billion a year. California's number 2 at about $3 billion a year. And Texas is a distant third, although we are third, at $1 billion a year. Within the next decade or two, that needs to flip. And Texas needs to be the number 1 trading and commerce partner with Israel, because we're the most like Israel, we're the most closely aligned with Israel, and we're the best place to do business in the United States. So anyone who wants to get involved with the alliance, I've sent out our contact information and my world-class executive director, Toba Hellerstein, who can get you involved. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be the back end of this presentation today, because whether as a YPO member or chairman of the Texas-Israel Alliance or chairman of Annandale Capital, I'm just right in the heart of all the potential we can have between Texas and Israel going forward. And I appreciate my sister in YPO, Nirit, having me as part of her presentation today.
It's just a great pleasure to be here with you, George, and you're so inspirational. It makes me really understand what I'm doing here. I haven't been in Texas long, but the potential has just been extraordinary as I'm experiencing all of these new people and contacts and dimensions. And I really believe that we can make this a game changer. I really believe we need to have more Israeli innovation coming here and setting roots and doing business here in Texas and developing those relationships further. And we're dependent on people like you for that to happen, and all of you who are listening. So we do have time for some questions. I'm going to quickly put on the screen some contact details so you know how to reach us. But in my case, I will also in the text box, as did George, put my contact details so that you're able to get back in touch. But if anyone has any questions, we would be just delighted to continue the conversation now online or offline later. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask?
While we're waiting to get a question, I would just point out a good example of what we're talking about here and how thrilled we are to have you in Texas and part of the team getting this turbocharged for the future too, is that Elbit Systems has a huge facility near Alliance Airport and Lockheed in Fort Worth. And Checkpoint Software, which you indicated, has 7,000 employees in the US and a very dynamic, large presence in Texas. So those are only 2 examples of Israeli companies that have a huge footprint in Texas. And as you well know, Dell EMC and AT&T both have huge incubator labs in Israel. So it's a two-way street.
It makes a lot of sense. And Nice Systems, I believe, is also based here, not far from where I am. Any questions?
We'd welcome your questions. Hopefully we'll have answers. I think we will.
I'm scrolling to see whether any might have come in. What was your experience, by the way, George, in interacting with business people in Israel in terms of the dynamics?
Yeah, it was. To be honest, it was fascinating. We had to cancel our most recent trade mission, which was scheduled for last month, unfortunately, because of the pandemic. But the one before that, we met with every major venture capital firm and fund in Israel, including Jaime Perez, Shimon Perez's son, who runs about $2.5 billion there, and the founder of Software, who's got about a $600 million fund they've just launched. The interesting thing for me was how few people understood or knew anything about Texas, and it was mainly about selling Israel to us, and which is fine. There's no problem with that. But whether it was the ambassador of the U.S. that we had dinner with the last evening, or some of the companies we met with, including Startup Nation and others, there was a real willingness to learn more about Texas and figure out how we can find beneficial ways to interact in the bilateral Texas-Israel ecosystem of business better. And it was interesting and inspiring too to make solid contacts that we followed up with ever since. But there's a lot of education involved at this point, to be honest.
So my friend Hope, welcome. It's so nice to see you, is asking about more specific examples of ways that Texas businesses could support the alliance. That's a wonderful question.
Well, that's a perfect question, actually. And the way would be to have CEOs of various corporations around Texas go on our trade missions and attend our events. We put on lots of conferences for water, agriculture. We had a spectacular healthcare conference at UT Southwestern last fall. So there's tons of ways to get involved. And obviously the most subjective and selfish, to be apparent, way is to fund the alliance. I'm heavily funding the alliance. David Weissman, who's a very leading Israeli businessman, is doing that as well. And Doug Deason, I want to give a shout out to Doug, whose family founded ACS, which is now part of Xerox, as a heavy funder, as well as others. And it gives us the jet fuel to expand what we're doing. And we're a lean, mean commerce machine in that we spend money extremely effectively. And our only purpose is to help all these other companies grow, whether it's doing business in Israel or having partners that they're in Israel do business in Texas. So we can invent dozens of ways to be involved. So all we need is to discuss it with, and it's a great question. Thank you.
If you will it will be, as Theodore Herzl said. I myself am looking for new ways to interact with the Alliance and include it in many of the things that we're doing at YPO and other, so that we can strengthen this organization, which is doing incredible things. It's a real shout out to Toba, who's one person with the energy of many. And so thank you so much, Toba, for being open and for moving these relationships forward. I am here as a resource also for anyone who wants to brainstorm ways to get involved with Israeli technology and innovation, and hopefully for forging that relationship with the Alliance moving forward. So if there are no other questions, we may just end a few minutes early. I'm going to give people another opportunity to voice. I think there was one question about specific industries. Are there industries specifically, George? I know that it was on your slide that maybe you want to address as best potentials for investment between the two places.
I'd be happy to do that. And I would also like, somebody mentioned Paul Singer and Startup Nation. And I would just add to that Paul Singer is a dear personal friend of mine, and we do quite a bit of policy work together, and we're very tightly aligned with them in terms of what we're working on. So we've got a great resource there. And Paul, industries I would really focus on are technology. I don't think most foreign countries understand just how in depth and intense the technology industry has become in Texas, especially in Dallas, Fort Worth, and Austin. There's a heavy technological footprint. I would also say healthcare. The Texas Medical Center in Houston is the largest health facility in the world. And UT Southwestern is one of the leading research hospitals and teaching institutions in the world. And we've got partnerships with Rabin Medical Center in Israel already, and there's going to be quite a bit of potential on the back end of that as well. Agriculture is obvious, defense is obvious, energy is obvious. There's almost no limit to the number of industries that are relevant in terms of the footprint. And I would say as well as robust and significant as for example, the Texas agricultural industry is, it probably will have a pretty low growth rate unless there's technological innovation in there, whereas healthcare technology, green energy solutions, things of this sort will probably have exponential growth over the next decade or so. So you have to look at the industry one by one and assess where to be involved, where the fit is, and what the growth rate's going to be.
Terrific. So on that high note, I want to thank everyone for being with us, especially you, George, for making time. It's just a privilege and a great pleasure to share a stage with you. And I hope that we have many other opportunities. And all of you with us, please join us in this great mission of strengthening these bonds. Looking forward to meeting you all in person soon. All the best.
My pleasure. Thank you. Shalom.